Madison Harper, 17, was the epitome of a model student. She wasn't the loudest in the classroom, nor was she interested in attention. Instead, Madison let her accomplishments speak for themselves. She had early acceptance letters from several prestigious universities, a full scholarship already lined up, and the title of valedictorian practically guaranteed. Academic excellence was her sole focus, and her life revolved around it. With no time for distractions, she kept her head down, studied hard, and kept to herself. To her, high school was a stepping stone to a bright future, a future that didn't involve drama or conflict. Her life was simple, disciplined, and predictable. But Madison's peaceful existence would soon be disrupted by an unexpected figure who was never supposed to be part of her world. Officer Jack Keane, a seasoned police officer with the local police department, had been assigned to oversee security during a community event at Madison's high school, a seemingly mundane responsibility. He was tasked with ensuring safety at a district-wide academic competition, one that Madison was taking part in. For Madison, this was just another event to showcase her hard work. But for Officer Keane, it was an opportunity for something far less innocent. At first, Madison paid no attention to him. The first encounter seemed harmless, just a brief moment when she crossed paths with Officer Keane after school. He asked about her safety during the event, perhaps out of routine. However, that fleeting interaction would soon reveal itself as the beginning of something darker. Madison's first instinct was to brush it off as nothing more than a routine check-in, but it didn't take long for his behavior to cross the line from professional to something unsettling. It was subtle at first, lingering glances in the hallway, offhand comments that seemed out of place, an uncomfortably long stare. But soon the discomfort turned into something more palpable as Officer Keane began to linger around Madison more and more, showing up in places he didn't need to be. His actions felt deliberate, but Madison had no idea what was driving them. She soon learned that Officer Keane had more than just an interest in her as a student. He had a personal stake. Tyler Keane, Officer Keane's son, was also a student at the same school. Tyler was once at the top of his class until Madison came along. With her intelligence and natural talent, she quickly became the one students and teachers alike looked to as the brightest. This created a fierce rivalry, and Tyler's pride couldn't handle the fact that a girl, and one who didn't fit his idea of what someone like him should be up against, was now the best student in class. He was used to being the center of attention, but Madison, with her quiet confidence and brilliance, stole the spotlight. Keane, seeing his son struggle with being outshone by Madison, began to let his personal feelings influence his professional role. Instead of seeing Madison as a model student, he viewed her as a threat to his son's ego, someone who needed to be put in her place. And so, Officer Keane began to use his authority as a police officer to harass Madison in increasingly disturbing ways. His initial actions, comments and glances, soon escalated into more direct forms of intimidation. He started showing up around places Madison frequented, even when it didn't make sense for him to be there. The interactions grew increasingly tense, with Madison feeling the weight of his unwarranted attention. Madison tried to brush it off at first. She convinced herself that his behavior was just part of being a teenager. Encountering people who would try to make you uncomfortable, just part of the high school experience. But as the harassment continued, she began to feel unsafe in her own environment. It wasn't just at school either. Officer Keane started appearing in places Madison frequented outside of school, like the local library where she worked part-time, standing a little too close, watching her a little too intently. It was no longer something she could ignore. The harassment was becoming too much, but Madison had no idea where to turn for help. Little did she know, the one person who could help her was closer than she realized. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the chaos began, a day that would end up etched in Madison's memory forever. The school was hosting its annual Academic Excellence Day, a special event where students like Madison were recognized for their achievements. Madison had been invited to speak at the event, a recognition she had earned after years of hard work and dedication. She had her binder in hand, papers neatly stacked, ready for her speech. As she walked through the hallways of Melrose High, her mind was focused on her upcoming presentation. She was in her element, confident, poised, and proud of everything she had accomplished. The noise of the hallway filled with students chatting and laughing didn't faze her. She walked with purpose, eyes straight ahead, barely acknowledging the people around her. But then everything changed in an instant. Officer Jack Keane, a local police officer who had been assigned to oversee security for the event, stood near the cafeteria doors. He was supposed to be watching out for any trouble, keeping the students safe during the busy day. Madison had seen him around before, but she had never paid much attention. He was just another officer doing his job, or so she thought. As she walked past, something strange happened. Keane stepped into her path, blocking her way. He was tall, his uniform stiff, his presence commanding attention. She didn't have time to step aside. He was already speaking. "You need to watch where you're going, young lady," he said, his voice loud enough for others to hear. Madison froze, confusion washing over her. She hadn't been distracted. She wasn't in a rush to get anywhere. "Excuse me," she said, caught off guard by his sudden attention. Keane's eyes glinted with something that Madison couldn't quite place. Amusement, disdain. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You didn't see me standing here?" he said in a tone that didn't match his words. Then, before she could react, he reached for his bottle of water and tilted it towards her. In that moment, Madison had no time to move. The cold water splashed directly onto her chest, soaking her shirt. The papers in her binder flew out in every direction, and the hallway filled with a sudden burst of laughter. She gasped, feeling the cold liquid cling to her clothes. Her hands shook as she bent down to pick up her scattered papers. The laughter from her classmates like a hot, searing fire under her skin. Keane stood there watching her, his expression unreadable. "Oops, guess someone's clumsy today," he said casually, as if he hadn't just made her the center of attention, as if she wasn't standing there humiliated and drenched. Madison could feel the weight of every eye in the hallway on her, their stares like daggers. She didn't want to look up, didn't want to see the cruel smiles, the whispered comments. Her skin burned with embarrassment, her shirt sticking uncomfortably to her body. She didn't say anything. She didn't even glance at him. Instead, she quickly gathered her papers, ignoring the giggles and murmurs that swirled around her. She turned on her heel and walked away, her mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. Why did he do that? Why had he targeted her of all people? She hadn't done anything to provoke him. In fact, she hadn't even looked at him. As she walked through the hall, her hands still trembling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The incident felt personal, deliberate. Keane had done this intentionally. This wasn't an accident. But why? By the time she reached the bathroom, Madison had already made up her mind. She wouldn't cry, not in front of anyone. She'd change in the nurse's office, pretend it didn't matter. She'd hold it all in, just like she always did. But deep down, Madison knew this was different. The sting of humiliation was sharp and biting, and no amount of quiet dignity could erase it. Later that day, after she changed into a dry shirt, Madison tried to push it all out of her mind. But it lingered, like an uncomfortable weight on her chest. Why had Officer Keane singled her out? What had she done to deserve this? She couldn't understand it, and the confusion gnawed at her. What had she missed? The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of unease for Madison. What had happened in the hallway felt like a dream, but the echoes of that moment never seemed to fade. As the school week wore on, she couldn't shake the embarrassment that weighed heavily on her chest. The laughter from her classmates had been deafening, and even though no one had openly mocked her afterward, she could feel the subtle shift in the way people looked at her. It was as if, suddenly, she had become the girl who had been humiliated in front of everyone. And the worst part was, she couldn't figure out why it had happened. What really unsettled Madison was how Keane seemed to be everywhere. At first, she thought she was imagining it. After all, a police officer at a high school is bound to be around during events and security checks. But as the days passed, she started to notice something strange. Officer Keane was appearing in places where he shouldn't have been. Places where a simple check-in didn't make sense. One afternoon, as Madison was walking to her car after school, she saw him standing by the parking lot, just staring at her. He wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't even doing anything that suggested he was on duty. He was simply watching her from a distance. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. Instead, he gave her a long, cold stare. It was unsettling, and Madison felt an instinctive chill crawl down her spine. She quickly got into her car and drove off, trying to ignore the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't just after school. At the local library where Madison worked part-time, she'd notice him lingering outside the windows, his eyes tracking her every move. She couldn't help but feel like she was being followed, and with every passing day, her suspicion grew. It felt as though Keane was constantly around, in places where he had no business being. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. It was deliberate. But Madison still didn't know the full story. She had no idea that Officer Keane's actions were part of something much bigger. She didn't know that his son, Tyler Keane, had a personal issue with her. Tyler, a once top student who had grown accustomed to being the best, couldn't handle being outshone by a girl. Madison's natural intelligence, her ability to outclass him in every subject, was a blow to his pride. Tyler had begun to feel a deep resentment for Madison, and it didn't take much for his father, Officer Keane, to join in. His son's discomfort became Keane's justification for targeting Madison. The bullying began subtly. Glances exchanged between the two men, whispering about Madison in the hallways. But it wasn't long before their passive-aggressive behavior escalated. Officer Keane was no longer just a figure in the background. He had become actively involved in making Madison's life harder. His tactics were insidious. He knew how to use his position of authority to intimidate her without ever overtly crossing the line. It wasn't until she noticed how Keane seemed to take pleasure in making her feel small that Madison began to realize the full extent of his hostility. Everything came to a head when Madison confided in her father, Elijah Harper. She didn't know how to deal with the situation anymore, and the growing anxiety in her chest was becoming unbearable. That night after dinner, she sat down with Elijah in the living room. She had never shared her worries with him before, but this time, she couldn't keep it to herself. "Dad," she began hesitantly, "there's something I need to tell you. It's about Officer Keane." She explained everything, the strange encounters, the feeling of being watched, and the way Keane had treated her. Elijah listened carefully, his face growing serious as she spoke. Madison had always thought of her father as strong, someone who could handle anything, but she could see the worry beginning to cross his features as she continued. "I had no idea," she finished, her voice trembling. "I don't know why he's doing this." Elijah stood up slowly, his mind racing. Officer Keane, a fellow officer in the city, wasn't just harassing Madison for no reason. There was something deeper going on here, and he could already sense the connection to his own position. He was the newly appointed police chief, and Keane, in some twisted way, might have seen his position as an opportunity for power, using his authority to make Madison suffer. But Elijah knew that whatever personal grudge Keane might have had, it would end now. His daughter deserved justice, and as a father and a police officer, it was his responsibility to ensure she got it. After Madison confided in him, Elijah Harper couldn't sit idly by. His mind raced as he thought about the possibility that Officer Keane, a member of the same police force he had just recently become the chief of, was using his position to harass his daughter. As a father, Elijah was furious. As a newly appointed police chief, his sense of duty demanded he take immediate action. That night, after Madison went to bed, Elijah stayed up late in his office, sifting through reports and reviewing the details of Officer Keane's work. His office, once filled with excitement and anticipation of starting a new chapter in his career, now felt oppressive. Elijah didn't know the full extent of Keane's actions yet, but he was determined to find out. The next morning, Elijah woke early, already mentally preparing himself for the difficult task ahead. He couldn't just confront Keane without evidence. He needed to be careful. He started by pulling Keane's personnel file. As the chief of police, Elijah had full access to the records of all officers under his command, and he quickly realized that Keane had a history. His file was filled with complaints about his treatment of citizens, particularly people of color. The complaints had been ignored or dismissed in the past, but now that Elijah was in charge, it became clear that this was not just an isolated incident. Keane's record showed a pattern of racial profiling and abusive behavior, but it was buried under layers of bureaucracy and politics. Elijah frowned as he read through the reports. He had suspected something was off when Keane had been overly familiar with Madison. But now he knew the truth. Keane was using his badge and his authority to intimidate her, and perhaps others because of his own deep-seated prejudices. Elijah's anger simmered, but he didn't act rashly. Instead, he took the careful approach he had learned over the years, especially in his military career. He knew that confronting Keane directly could have serious consequences, so he decided to gather all the necessary evidence first. He reached out to a few trusted officers who had witnessed Keane's conduct, asking them to provide written statements about his behavior. He also began to quietly review surveillance footage from the school and from other places where Keane had been near Madison. The more Elijah gathered, the clearer the picture became. There was no doubt that Keane had crossed a line, repeatedly. His behavior toward Madison wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern of racial harassment and abuse of power. Elijah was now faced with a dilemma. How could he protect his daughter and maintain the integrity of the police department? How could he bring this information to light without causing further harm? After several days of careful investigation, Elijah called Madison into his office. He didn't want to alarm her, but he needed to make sure she understood what was happening. When she walked in, he could see the worry in her eyes. It had been a stressful week for both of them, but Elijah wanted to reassure her that they were getting closer to an end to this ordeal. "Madison," Elijah began, his voice calm but firm, "I've been looking into everything you told me about Officer Keane. I'm going to make sure this stops, but I need you to understand that it's going to take time. I've gathered enough evidence to know that his behavior was wrong, but we need to be careful about how we proceed. I'm taking this seriously, and I promise you, justice will be done." Madison nodded, her relief palpable. She had known her father was in a position of power, but hearing him say it so plainly gave her hope. She had always trusted him, but now she could see how much this was weighing on him. She wasn't just his daughter, she was also part of the community he swore to protect, and he wasn't going to let anyone, not even another officer, hurt her. "I trust you, Dad," Madison said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't want anyone else to go through what I did." "I know, sweetheart," Elijah replied, his hand resting gently on hers. "And we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. We're going to take it to the right channels, and I'll make sure Keane faces the consequences of his actions." The following days were tense, as Elijah quietly worked behind the scenes to gather everything he needed to confront Officer Keane. His quiet determination was unwavering, and though he knew the stakes were high, he had no intention of letting this slide. Madison, for her part, had become more withdrawn. The events with Keane had shaken her to her core, but knowing that her father, now in a position of power, was working to make things right gave her a sense of hope she hadn't had in weeks. Finally, the moment of reckoning came. Elijah, with the evidence he had gathered, scheduled a meeting with the school principal and a district representative to discuss Keane's behavior. Elijah was calm, methodical, and focused, traits he had perfected over years of military service and police work. But there was an underlying steel in his voice that made it clear he was not going to let the matter go until justice was served. When they met, Elijah laid out the evidence in front of them. Reports from witnesses, surveillance footage, and formal complaints all painted a clear picture of Officer Keane's actions. He was not just guilty of racial profiling and unwarranted harassment. His behavior was part of a disturbing pattern. The school principal and district representative exchanged uneasy glances as Elijah calmly explained the severity of the situation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. "We need to take action," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not asking for a slap on the wrist. This kind of behavior has no place in law enforcement or in our schools. Keane needs to be held accountable for what he's done to my daughter and for what he's done to others." The district representative nodded, his face pale. He knew this was going to be a long process, but the facts were undeniable. The next step was clear. Officer Keane would be suspended pending an investigation, and the school would begin reviewing its policies on security personnel and their conduct. But Elijah wasn't satisfied with just that. He made it clear to the principal and district representative that he was taking the matter outside the school system if necessary. He had already reached out to a civil rights attorney in Little Rock, and the news media would soon be made aware of what had been happening at Melrose High. The public outcry would be the final push needed to ensure that Keane's actions wouldn't be swept under the rug. By the end of the week, news of Keane's suspension had spread like wildfire. And it wasn't long before a local journalist with the Arkansas Tribune broke the story. The article, which didn't sensationalize the events but presented the facts plainly, titled "Local Officer Under Investigation for Harassing Student," was picked up by the local news channels. Madison's face was blurred in the photo accompanying the story, but everyone who knew her recognized her instantly. The story quickly gained momentum, and soon Keane's past actions were under full public scrutiny. More students came forward with stories of how Keane had treated them. Tyler Keane, once the golden child of his high school, found himself ostracized by his peers, who had once admired his athletic ability and his father's position. For Madison, the attention was not something she sought, but in a strange way, it helped her feel like her voice had been heard. She had fought back without even realizing it. By simply speaking up, by trusting her father, she had exposed the truth, and the community was now forced to confront it. Keane, on the other hand, found himself facing not just suspension, but potential criminal charges. The investigation into his actions was expanding, and there were whispers of past abuses, of other complaints that had never been taken seriously. For Madison, knowing that Keane would not be allowed to continue abusing his power brought a measure of peace. A few weeks later, Officer Keane's badge was officially taken away. The police department issued a public statement acknowledging the mishandling of complaints against him and vowing to improve their policies to prevent such abuses in the future. Madison had won. Justice had been served, and in the months that followed, Madison began to reclaim her life. She didn't have to hide anymore. Her classmates, who had once whispered behind her back, now treated her with respect. They had seen the injustice, and now they saw the strength it took to stand up to it. Madison didn't just graduate with honors. She graduated with a sense of pride and empowerment that she had never known before. As for Elijah, he stood beside her at her graduation, proud of the young woman she had become. They didn't need to say much. The bond between them spoke louder than words. For Elijah, this fight had been about more than just his daughter's future. It was about ensuring that no one, not even an officer of the law, could use their position to silence or harm those who were powerless. Keane was gone. Madison was free, and the truth in the end had shaken the ground beneath them all.